possible with God, and we see our own human limitations. And what Jesus wants to get the disciples to understand is that they've got to begin to see like God sees. And so he tells them, use what you have. And they say, okay, well, we've got these 2 fish and these 5 loaves of bread. And he says, do what I would do with them. Give them away. Let God use it. And so they do that. And they begin to share what little resources they have. And what does God do with that? Well, God takes their modest offering and he multiplies it. And he makes that little bit of resource go a long way, so much so that not only is this great multitude of 5,000 plus people fed to filling themselves up, but there's 12 baskets of food left over. In other words, there's more food left over than they actually brought into that event in the first place. And I know what you're thinking. I'd really like to see that happen. Right? We believe in God and everything, but if we could see that, we'd really believe. Right? And we'd really devote ourselves if we could see something like that happen. And what I want to tell you tonight is that you already have. You're skeptical, I'm sure, and that's okay. But, think about it. 3 weeks ago, I came to you with a very modest plan for ministry. I said, we've got these 2 twins from Tanzania, and I've offered to sponsor one of them, and I need you guys to help me to sponsor the other one, because how can you tell one you're going to get an education and not the other? And so I said, just, whatever resources you have, help us out here. And if we had just sponsored those 2 boys, I would have been so thrilled. And 3 weeks later, we're finished with 7 kids.
Ooh.
So in other words, what happened is God took our little bit of resources, and he does what God always does. He takes what little offering we have, and he multiplies it. And he makes it go much farther than you and I would ever dare to dream of. Because God sees abundance, and you and I see scarcity. God sees an opportunity, and you and I see obstacles. God sees that anything is possible with God, and you and I see our own limitations. And part of what it means to be followers of Jesus is to retrain the way we see the world. I learned something about this from a great source. A couple of years ago, I had the great privilege of meeting Millard and Linda Fuller. Does those names mean anything to you?
Mm-mm.
Millard and Linda Fuller were the co-founders of Habitat for Humanity.
Oh.
And they came to Winchester, Virginia a couple of years ago to a neighboring church. And Millard Fuller was just such a great guy. He died about a year ago. And he used to do the most crazy things, the most amazing things. He'd come into a city, and he would gather together all of the leaders of the city. He'd take the religious leaders, and the civic leaders, and the politicians, and the business leaders, and he'd get them together in a room like this, and he'd say, when's your date? And they'd scratch their heads, and they'd say, our date for what? And he'd say, your date for eradicating substandard housing in your community. And they think, oh my, there's a lot of bad-looking houses in our community. How in the world are we going to do that? You see, we see obstacles. We see scarcity. And Millard Fuller saw abundance. And he said, when's your date? And they said, well, we don't even know how to do this. How are we going to do this? And he says, I didn't ask you that. I asked you, when's your date? And so they'd say, well, I don't know, it's going to take at least 10 years. And he'd say, good. Now you've got a date. In 10 years, you're going to eradicate substandard housing in your community. Can I quote you on that to the press? And he wouldn't leave until they committed to that date. And then he would leave. Because he said that, you see, the problem isn't how are we going to do this? Because if you offer up what little resources you have, then God is going to take that and multiply it beyond your wildest dreams. So the problem isn't how are we going to do it? The problem is, do you have the will to do it? And the truth is, the church has all kinds of gifts that God can use just the way he did in Luke's gospel, in that feeding story. And God can take it and multiply it and do what God does to build up the kingdom of God. But the question is, does the church have the will to do what Jesus is calling us to do? Because if we can just say yes, if we can just set a date, if we can just say, yes, we're going to be a part of this mission, then God will use what resources we have and put it to use and make it go a lot farther than we could ever dare to dream about. But the church often sees scarcity instead of abundance. And in fact, it's not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of the love of God. The church sees scarcity rather than abundance. In other words, the church limits their vision of what the future looks like. The church limits it. They want to talk about who's going to be left out of it. I get in trouble for this all the time. In my first parish down in Martinsville, I had this really cantankerous guy by the name of Fred. And Fred was always very surly, and he came up to me one Sunday, and he was very mad, which wasn't unusual, and he said, "Pastor, you're not doing your job." And that kind of put me back on my heels, because usually it takes people a lot longer to figure that out. And I said, "Well, do you have anything particular in mind, Fred?" And he said, "Yes, you're not preaching enough hellfire and damnation." And I thought, oh, thank goodness he hasn't figured it out yet. But I said, well, let me get this straight, Fred. You're telling me that I'm not telling you that you're going to hell often enough? And he says, no, not me, those people. I said, oh, okay, so you're okay, but those people are in trouble. Is that what you're telling me? How did you manage to pull that off, Fred? Well, he didn't like that very much, and so he kind of stared and he glared at me and he said, you don't even believe in hell, do you? I said, Fred, of course I do. I've sat through too many church council meetings with you to believe anything else. And that was a little flippant of me, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I'll have to confess that sometime. Not yet, but one of these days. But the truth is, I've been around too many folks who don't need for me to consign them to hell, because they are fully aware of the fact that they're already there. And isn't it the job of the church to open up the promised future of God to people who can't imagine that they have a place in that future? Didn't Jesus come to free people from the hell that they're living in? And what is hell, after all, if not a belief that you'll matter to God or to anybody else, and that the future does not belong to you? So people are already there, folks, and what we need to do is be part of this mission that Jesus calls Kingdom of God, to liberate people from their hell, and to let them know that they do matter to God and to us, and that the future is wide open, and that God's grace is not scarce, but is abundant, and that it's going to include a lot more folks than you and I often give God credit for. We have to learn to see the way God sees. We see scarcity, God sees abundance. And today is a day that in the wider church we call All Saints Day. And on All Saints Day, I think about people like Millard and Linda Fuller. I think about people who understand this idea that our job is to kind of open up the future to people and to turn the church inside out. To turn the church inside out so that our focus is on those who are least, last, lost, and left out. And that it's our job to just break open the gates of heaven to a people who can't imagine that they matter enough to be included in it. Jesus said, you give them something to eat. And I couldn't let tonight go by without responding to that command of Jesus. And the great thing about this day that the church calls All Saints is that there's a promise that when we share in this meal of Jesus, that we're joined with saints.